Hello everyone, today we talk about Maronites and other Syrian Christians during the Crusades, and we will focus chiefly on the equipment, talking about what could be the average fighter in this context. Naturally, we will address also, broader questions, but we will leave the description of these native troops, right, including Syrians, Maronites. We already made a video on the Turcopolls, right? We will also on the Armenians, and we will expand on that. So we will give a bit of background, and eventually we will pass to the analysis of a bunch of Syriac Gospels from some from Syria proper, others from the surrounding regions like Asia Minor, Iraq, etc. From chiefly the 13th century. There are, to understand from the illuminations maybe something more about their equipment, the various influences from naturally peoples and cultures that at this point in the Near East were much more militarily influenced. So essentially today we will observe how Byzantine, Frankish, Arab, but Seljuk and the Persian through them influences were present at this point. And so, generally speaking, we also open another question, which is very interesting. That is, what was the actual military role of the inhabitants of these Near Eastern regions that were occupied by the Crusades, right, and that were ruled as such. And we're talking about vast areas: Syria, Palestine, Lebanon. That's where mostly we will observe the Maronites, and that are already by themselves, in fact, fairly composite areas from an ethnical point of view, and especially for the, let's say, political and social, and therefore military participation to the Frankish armies. We made a video specifically about, I don't remember the title anymore, but you can go look at it in the Crusades playlist, that dealt in part also with this not just even local Christians, but even Muslim troops who were hired, etc., aside from the Turcopolls, right? And the problem is that, historically speaking, we don't know much about them. The Crusades are largely led in a, let's say, at least the canonical ones in the Outre-mer, we are dedicating narrowly our attention now in the in this 3rd century, from the end of the 11th and the end of the 13th century. Needless to say is that by the last century were much better documented than the previous ones, but the great problem overall is that, historiographically speaking, is that these are the centuries of the rise of feudalism, let's call it in this way, that very often in a substantially, in fact, feudal society like the one it was created, also institutionally, politically speaking, by the Crusaders in the Near East, tended to ignore culturally all those who were fundamentally not knights, right? So this elite, right, that dominated this broader European area, Frankish, let's say, political institutional legacy that had somewhat flattened the other communities that, albeit reviving, especially during the 12th, 13th century, were still fundamentally subordinated to the elites, right, in this regard. And you can understand that even the Crusader history is not very well documented. We know of very few. We have seen it in some battles. We have made a video about. We largely rely, and it's normal for the time, but perhaps more for the Outre-mer sources to know very scanty details about even just the tactical development of battles that we have analyzed, but more broadly, what was the military organization of Crusader armies. And the idea is that the feudal society had a true contempt for inferior classes, right? This was at the limit of sort of proto-racial discrimination, in the sense that the lower classes were considered as not fully human, even by certain standards. And you can imagine as even going across sea overseas in these lands, they were Christian, but they were different types of Christian, and also mixed unitly with other cultures, etc., would make this people, the Franks, feel like towards them. This is true even in areas like, I don't know, if you look at the Celtic fringe, with the Irish, the Welsh considered as barbarians, or even when the Normans conquered Sicily, there was this stigma on the Hauteville because basically the Siculo-Normans were perceived as, poulains, right, bastards, barely like instead the the French and the German culture was considered like. And this idea of the fringe or the frontier naturally is much more emphasized with during the Crusades proper, but we can't and we lack substantial information about the role of these troops. Yet, it's very likely that actually the local populations, as always, also in the rest of Europe, actually contributed in a much sounder way than the sources tell. And there were, also other vicious dynamics. For example, Syria and other lands ruled by the Crusaders at this point, so the injection of these Frankish renegades, / mercenaries / martyrs, right, that actually pre-existed the Crusades, right. The Crusades were basically nothing new in terms of the expansion of the horizons, the Westerners, in the sense that you can find plenty of Frankish mercenaries all over the place before the Crusades in the Near East. And naturally, even locally speaking, the previous cultures, you would take the Muslims. This is particularly true for the Turks, the heavily persecuted Seljuk Turks. It's true for the Arabs. It's true even for the Byzantines, actually, that are posed under a substantial Frankish influence from military matters during this time. That naturally heavy cavalry, right, the thickly compacted formations of heavily armored knights with a shock charge tactics were beginning to be naturally the protagonists even in these areas. Naturally, with the arrival of the Crusaders, it was true the other countries didn't develop, let's say, as much as that heavy cavalry as the Franks. They were, generally speaking, capable actually of surpassing the other tactical formulas on the field. But naturally, we don't have to forget that it was properly a feudal culture in the Muslim world at this time, and that was also recognized from both sides. Like, there was aside from the atrocious and indescribable levels of violence that this period saw, also a great admiration actually for this equestrian culture that brought this peoples living from very different areas actually to realize even what they had in common, because the broader culture of the steppes here had substantial impacts in previous centuries all over Europe, the Middle East, now the Near East as well. So there is naturally the question of telling, however, under this heavily mounted, heavily armored and mounted elite, and where these other locals were included, because the troops that we can't see deployed by the Crusader states were not, other than the heavily armored knights, are actually not very different from the ones that existed in Europe. Like, there were usually local militias, allies, peoples, naturally of various extraction, especially in the Near East, the Middle East, right? The Muslim invasion in these areas had brought, literally everything but any kind of ethnic or homogenization, right? This was the Muslim world was incredibly much more varied and composite than even the European one in its with all its shades and differences, and even in there naturally different external influences as well. including Muslim one. So it's been suggested, at least, so normally cavalry at this point was supported on a regular basis by infantry, right? And this was especially even during Crusade times, where in several battles, infantries were quite important for making the Crusader Knights achieving the most important feats. And naturally, the two arms never operated one without the other. And if this happened, it would lead to military disaster. And this is true, basically, aside from the steppes cultures, for every single military in the world at this point. Not even in the steppe, actually, everything was nomadic, was just mounted, right? It's been naturally suggested that local Syrians may have supplied the bulk of the Crusaders' infantry, right? Yet there is little evidence to support this, right? And there is, on the contrary, this attitude that is quite evident in Christian sources that looked upon the Syrians with great contempt, in a way, right? Especially when they were actually employed, and we have therefore the information of their presence in Frankish armies. And some of them were, however, very effective nevertheless. So we can't understand here exactly whether these prejudices were just, the Frankish elite, this typical chivalric mindset that, I must say, especially in the Crusader states, was somewhat diluted by other mindsets. For example, the Italian communes that were highly regarded in the Crusades, because basically all the logistics and the naval operations were dependent on them, somewhat mild than this ultra, let's say, conservative feudal chivalric mindset, right? It was also kind of an Italianization of certain characters that naturally entailed a much more, let's say, republican, at least, character, but that's somewhat, I wouldn't say superficial, but at least it didn't change the essentials, the fundamentals of the Frankish political institutional culture of the Crusader states. So we would understand whether this idea that the local Syrian population was unreliable is true or not. We actually see that in several occasions were quite important. For example, they helped Raymond of Saint-Gilles in the conquest of Tripoli, and they were surely summoned, like basically every other community, like they were the bulk of the local population in the first place, in conditions of emergency, right? As it was normal, like with the ban in back in Europe, right? This happened, for example, in 1124. There are other examples. Others were employed for garrison duties, right? So this is, in a nutshell, whatever, like, this happened all over the world, literally, right? The local populations being co-opted for these military tasks, and so on, right? But the idea, naturally, in feudalized areas is that these militias are not particularly reliable in open field, at least in terms of stopping power. They're not decisive at all. These are the centuries in which chivalry and cavalry properly dominated the battlefields. It's just 2 centuries all over medieval history, contrarily-wise to what, generally speaking, it's believed. But it's enough at this point to actually have very, very heavy influence, like they always had, at the point of crushing even the moral resources, the self-confidence of the subordinated classes. The fort didn't have much, even to inspire to participate to war, right? Because these were local militias that were brought to fight in wars that they didn't give much damn about, in comparison, at least, with their local needs, and they didn't want to participate. This may be actually another sociological explanation of why certain stigmas actually remain. For example, William of Tyre points out that, generally speaking, the Syrians were of a timorous nature, quote, a race which is regarded by us as weak and effeminate, right? These were typical prejudices that had existed, you can argue, since the ancient times, right? This kind of Indo-European population, think about the same Rome that considered, I don't know, even the Greeks or are in Oriental populations as effeminated because they had somewhat been demilitarized. There is all a reason in this. Now we can expand on it, but that was the stigma attached. Naturally, the conductivity of these peoples is to be measured on other parameters, right? This is not right because these troops were not really reliable. It's just we would need a political and social cross section of them to understand really what were their motivations, their equipment, and so on. Jacques Vitry, Bishop of Acre in the 13th century, wrote that the Syrians were altogether unwarlike and in battle are as helpless as women. So here's the prejudice, a stereotype that recurs again. Save for some of them who use bows and arrows, but are unarmored and ready for running away. These men are known as Syrians. For the most part, they are untrustworthy, two-faced, cunning foxes, just like the Greeks, which means the Byzantines, right? And this already tells you what was the moral standard of these judgments, right? The Byzantines had some of the freaking most advanced military of the time. Liars and turncoats, lovers of success, traitors, easily won over with bribes. When men will say one thing and mean another, and think nothing of theft and robbery. For a small sum of money they become spies and tell the Christians secrets to the Saracens, right? So you can easily read here what the deal was. These populations naturally had been, the Crusaders were just now the next domination. Right, the fact that also the discriminant of being Christian in a Crusader state was not actually being better off than Christian in a Muslim state. It was basically the same. Sometimes it was even worse, and for many reasons. Let's leave aside now ecclesiastical policy in Crusader states because it's fairly complicated. But there was always this greater plan of Western Christianity to to basically come to control these other churches that had always existed since, even late Roman times, that had survived, and fairly, well, actually, during under Muslim domination, now wanted to be, controlled and reorganized and forced to conversion to the Roman creed. Naturally, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem had its own kind of autonomous ecclesiastical policy, but the intentions were not better in this regard. And it's a bit what would happen even with the Orthodox, right? Many Orthodoxes actually in the Byzantine Empire even opened gates to the Ottoman Turks centuries later because they preferred definitely an Islamic government to the one of the papacy. This is not a judgment of any type personally. I'm more leaning to the papal side in this regard. I wish effectively the Western Christians had kept, if anything, if the Byzantine Empire had to fall those lands, but it didn't happen. But objectively, we know this from sources that are quite clear, and they're not just the Westerners complaining about the locals, but these tensions really existed, and they were dictated exactly for this reason. Right, because under Muslims, at least these communities had some kind of autonomy on their own as Christians, right? But the point here is much deeper. It's not just a religious policy. It's actually the fact that, this local powers always tried to. But these communities were not just like flat, let's say, villagers, etc. There were local lords. There were local communities that were military organized and ambitious, and naturally flourished wherever any other power was weaker. This is kind of a constant. Wherever big power shrinks, there is gap filled by this fillable for these other minor powers. They're not much better. That they're the same kind of mortiers and small lords who want to just remain out there doing whatever they like on their own. But what is interesting in these wars that we will see, especially the one about that basically all the Syrians were inept, effeminate, except for these guys with bows and arrows, right? That are, however, unarmored. This was as if this was a problem in itself, and that, however, ran away, right? Which is kind of logical because that's what unarmored troops are meant to do, especially when they are missile troops, and that even Jacques de Vitry, that doesn't, it's not flattery. towards the Syrians recognized that these troops that actually coincide strikingly with the depictions of the Maronites specifically, but also other groups, frankly, Maronites just being the most famous in this regard, is an admission that these were actually very good troops. And the fact also here, the stigma of fighting with missile weapons was the face of... This was an ecclesiastical source, by the way, and we also must realize always that as long as ecclesiastical sources write history at this point, there are generally less military details, and also we got this impression historically that, for example, I don't know, medieval knights didn't use missile weapons, which is actually false and wrong. They knew all how to use them, even on horseback. They didn't do it because their tactics, the traditional tactics, let's say, were more effective, but there was this kind of idealization of what the chivalric combat should be like, but the reality of warfare was very, very different from the ideal, and probably even the same local knights didn't actually give a damn had they had to parade their military capabilities to even say, okay, yeah, I used a crossbow or a bow on horseback. Well, what's the deal, right? They used them as sighted weapons, actually. And this is particularly evident even if you look at that video on the Turkopoles that sometimes were not just local Syrians of even some alleged Turkish descendancy because of the name. Sometimes they were even Greeks that became Turkopoles because they were more prized, right? But some were Franks, right? Some were, saying, Western Europeans that fought simply like Turks, like as horse archers, right? And there is not even, you find videos on YouTube like, oh, did Crusaders have horse archers? Well, yeah. What's the deal? I mean, why shouldn't they have it? Well, this is not a video game. You're not choosing the roles. People fight normally with all the weapons they have. And actually they had plenty of horse archers renowningly in their armies. And those were the Turkopoles. Nice discovery. But aside from this, what is fascinating is concentrating on this, on the Maronites, as per title, which were actually the principal native Christian element in the county of Tripoli, right? They came from Lebanon, from this area. They were settled principally around the areas of Jibat, Sari, Kisravan, and around Jabayah. And these are mountainous areas, as you know, and you may even say, these guys, had more missile weapons because, with gravity, altitude, you can, it's possible, right? And there is also this idea that since ancient world, the area was famous for archery. Remember the famous Levantine Syrian archers in the Roman army. Yeah, there's been a bit of stereotypization about that. Actually, they came from many different places because it's not a big deal to know how to use a bow, right? But this idea that effectively, Syria being the easternmost Roman province, using composite bows, this areas, used it. They were good, and the Romans hired them. Well, this tradition seems to have remained under the Maronites, right? If there are beautiful historical records, there were Maronites of I don't know, the early 20th century using bows. Yeah, why not? Traditionally speaking, at least in their traditional costumes and weaponry, yeah. This was all stuff that was particularly, normal, ethnically speaking, in these areas to that had a archery tradition since the times of the Assyrians and even before, right? And the Maronites were actually also many at this time. First of all, just, we were talking about the Maronites. Maronites are part of the Maronite Church. It is today an Eastern Catholic, yet sui juris, so juridically independent, particular church, right, that is in full communion at this point and the worldwide Catholic, with the Pope and the worldwide Catholic Church. And it was established back in, let's say, essentially from the 4th to the 7th century AD, and it was this congregation movement with Saint Maron from the Taurus Mountains as an inspirational leader and patron saint, marked the first period of their history. Our faith was characterized instead by the establishment of the monastery of Saint Maron on the Orontes, right? And built after the Council of Chalcedon to defend the doctrines of the council, right? And this monastery is very famous. One of the greatest monastery in the region of Secunda Syria, right? It has more than 300 hermitages around it, right? According to ancient records. So we're talking about very ancient times, and this community lived on basically after the around the area of there was a sede vacant essentially after the Islamic conquest, as you realize. They remained as an autonomous church, and this is this group we're talking about. They numbered about, at this time, Crusader times, from 30 to 40,000, which is a lot, right? This is maybe the source is, I don't know. It's not an exaggeration if you count especially the world population as such, but for those time standards, it's not a few, right? So, William of Tyre, that, as we have seen, had definitely not flattery opinions about the rest of the Syrians, says actually that the Maronites were very militarily skilled. Right? He says a stalwart race, valiant fighters, and of great service to the Christians in the difficult engagements which they so frequently had. Right? And even Vitry, that we have read before, said they are numerous, use bows and arrows, and are swift and skillful in battle. So Frankish sources are kind of unanimous in pointing out that the Maronites had this higher, let's say, military average, let's put it this way, than the other Syrians, and they're recorded, especially because of their bows, right? And the Maronites served mostly in the Tripolitanian armies, right, fighting under their own chieftains, that had the Arabic name of Muqaddam, right? So this this area is Semitic language by itself. So there are similarities with Arab as it has nothing to do with their religion, and some of them even received fiefs. This is something we've seen also with the Turkopoles, especially in Cyprus, where they were settled and they had to serve even as heavily armored knights. And the same goes with the Maronites, actually, because the idea of a fief is conceptually the fact that the fief could be even just monetary, right? It doesn't have, but they were naturally landed properties that were enough to sustain actual knights, right? And in fact, we find in other sources other native Christian knights with surnames that go as Arabi, Kelkarab, El-Tefaha, etc. While in Antioch, in the Principality of Antioch, such knights bore Greek names, right? Since Antioch received a greater, it was part of the Byzantine Empire, was much more exposed to Greek culture and military influences, etc. And between 1192 and 1194, Guy de Lusignan is reported to have even introduced a large number of Maronites into Cyprus, right? Just like the Turkopoles we were talking about before. And we have this number of 30,000 of them, which is a lot, and frankly it's probably not correct. But still, it's a lot of people, considering also that this followed the defeat of Aten and all the collapse, the eventual collapse of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So lots of Christians definitely abandoned those lands and considered that, because of in spite of all the attritions that existed, after all, many of them had been tied to this Crusader state's destiny, and they preferred to follow them rather than remaining where, because their fortunes were tied. And these Maronites of Cyprus seem to have been sort of militia, though, probably including knights as well as the Turkopoles. And for those we have direct evidence of it. For the Maronites, I don't think so. And some were even eventually part of the retinue that accompanied the Hospitalier to Rhodes and later still to Malta, right? So this presence was, went on for a long time. It became somewhat this appalled community that, however, stuck to the Christian effort against the Muslims. So today we don't talk about the Turkopoles, but the idea in this context is that there surely have been Maronite Turkopoles, right? There is nothing strange, because the definition of Turkopole is so loose and so large that surely there were certain Maronites that went serving as Turkopoles, and there were surely in Christian armies as well as in Muslim armies. Actually, we have evidence of the Maronites fighting even against the Franks, the Crusaders. So, as we were saying before, this thing went on on political basis that have basically substantially nothing to do with religion in many ways, so passing to consider what these troops could be equipped like. We have the stereotype, as we've seen, essentially of Maronites being equipped as archers, right? We don't see many of them. As we were saying before, these communities were pretty large, and the broader Syrian population was even larger. But we have a few evidence of their participation to Frankish armies, few direct one at least. And we know that they dressed essentially just like the Muslims. Just think of what this means, right? Burkhard of Mount Sion says that these local Syrians distinguished themselves just by a woolen girdle from the Muslims, and for the rest they were basically the same. So we're talking about cultures that, aside from the religious differences, were naturally coexisting since centuries and centuries in the same place, and therefore they were product essentially of the very same military culture, right? This, especially with the Arabs. Now, the relative newcomers were the Turks that, telling the truth, were around since a much longer time than the Seljuk expansion proper, but as a military culture. And these were kind of more sedentary communities that had in common, right, with the Arabs, like since the first time in the conquest, and also with the broader kind of Syro-Hellenic substratum that was typical of Hellenistic culture since the times of Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire, Byzantine times, etc. So these areas, and naturally, were very much in common with all the rest of the Mediterranean. Right? Think about Italian trade with Syria was at the end of the Silk Roads, what at least one of its probably its most important branch, and this contact with the Western Mediterranean was going on since ever, right? Historically speaking. So even in here, military influences are very clear, right? We were talking the other day about, Spanish knights of this very same centuries. We find easily Middle Eastern influences in Spanish armament at that time. The reason being, there was this continuous contact that had, especially in this very century, the 12th and 13th century, was literally exploding in terms of intensity between Europe and the Near East. So just think about the military technology, the obvious commonalities that existed with these troops that, however, were still different enough to be distinguished from the rest of the Crusaders. Also because they were not a feudal society, right? Like in Persia, you had a feudal society. In here you didn't. In here you had fundamentally scattered community. Yeah, there was a sort of form of feudalism in its own way. Think about the Itka, right? Was a sort of more central. It was more similar to the Byzantine pronoia than to the Frankish vassalic beneficiary system. But in the essentials, even in there, the thing was the same. It's just that society was very different. These were normally smaller parcels of land, and therefore there wasn't this excessive power or aristocracy like in Western Europe. But this had its own faults in turn at the same time. Another important distinction point of Maronite and other Syrian Christians at this time from the Franks were their long beards, right? Of which apparently these locals were extremely proud. XI-XIII relates how they cherished them with great care and especially glory in them. Right, so this was not, symbol of manhood or warriorhood, and it was a privilege for them. While the Crusaders were mostly French in culture. At this point, they were shaped, generally speaking. It was the fashion of the time. And the main weapon of the Maronites was the composite bow, right? Vitry records that, as we've seen, these few warlike Syrians also used bows and arrows, but they're unarmored and ready for running away. Now, as we were saying before, it's very likely that the Maronites might have been included in the Turcopoles, right? So we don't know in this regard what Jacques de Vitry is not referring to the Maronites explicitly, but we think there might have been, because we were reading what William of Tyre said, mentioning them explicitly, that this description could fit easily as into the Turcopoles. There were essentially, yes, local Syrians that fought like the typical Turkish fashion as horse archers. So the fact especially that they ran away, right, this tells us nothing about the fact. I don't know what's the verb in Latin. It would be interesting to check that. I forgot to do it, but this is valid for basically every type of skirmisher, including mounted ones, and we know the Turcopoles were essentially mounted. And as we have seen before, this might have been the case as well for the Maronites, right? So that are typically represented once again as this kind of local territorial militia of farmers and shepherds, and that were fundamentally stationary, sedentary, and therefore they were largely infantry. Yes, okay, but these guys had horsemen as well, so it's not a big deal. And they, of course, knew pretty well how to fight on foot as well as on horseback with their bows, and not armed. In fact, we're practically sure that some Maronite chieftains at least fought on horseback and wore armor, basically in the same way the Franks did. Right? There is no doubt that some Frankish equipment was in use also. As we will see later, the local material culture differed somewhat in, if anything, in style. Certain characteristics from the Western European one, but the concept of heavily armored knight, shock charged tactics were there as well, right? As we were saying before, it's just that this was not it was a feudalized society, so there were a relatively few heavier troops. This is the whole deal of the Crusades, right? As we were saying before, it's not that the Franks were just the heavily armored guys, and here in the Near East there was no one to match them with those tactics. It's simply that there were less, right? And this gap was compensated with horse archery generally. So this means that on average, yes, the Muslim armies were kind of softer, but also more dangerous at a distance because of missile fire. So the local Maronites were essentially the same along this line. We also know that they took considerable amounts of arms and armor from the Muslims, which was undoubtedly reused after capture. A lot of equipment would be also purchased from the Franks and from the Muslims, but predominantly from the Muslims, and for this reason they were fundamentally indistinguishable from the Saracens. Right? We know actually there were signs of recognition, as we know of a Maronite chieftain that is recorded having the sign of the cross on his armor, right? But even in this regard, we have to stay open even for the same Crusaders, because lots of representations of Crusader knights are coming from literally from Western Europe illuminations. For example, we know that even how the Franks fought like in the Near East was somewhat different, slightly, but still different from the one in Western Europe, right? Even the lighter equipment, because of the very intensely hot weather sometimes. Look at the conditions in which they were fighting at. Hatton, I made a bit about it recently. But there were naturally other local styles that were adopted by the same Crusaders. I mean, in these times, you don't throw away weapons because kind of they look like Muslim. I mean, it doesn't make us any single sense. You kill a Muslim Faris and you take his armor and swords, and what do? Right? You maybe, yeah, of course, it's not so immediate to know to learn how to fight with different types of swords. For example, not even archery is naturally so immediate, but over time, here talking about centuries of Crusader presence, of course there were Frankish knights that were skilled to fight exactly like a Muslim. At least in this horse archery styles, there were different types of weapons, sabers, but other particular swords that exist at this point. And the Mongols also introduced some important change in these areas, military influence, the equipment, etc. But anyway, this difference was not a big deal, right? There were ways to distinguish troops that are so many that we don't even count. I mean, here the stressing too much the difference between how one side was equipped, another side was not. It's basically meaningless, because as we've seen, and we've made plenty of videos about this, there were lots of Christians fighting in Muslim armies against other Christians, Muslims fighting in Christian armies against other Muslims. There were naturally Muslims normally fighting against other Muslims throughout all the Muslim world, as well as much as Christians fighting regularly against other Christians throughout all the Christian world. So the problem of distinguishing their equipment is literally devoid of any meaning conceptually at all, right? And there were naturally, ensigns, banners, certain code keywords, right, and etc. And this was fundamentally, this is as much as we know, generally speaking, about what these local Syrian troops could be equipped like. So I think we can pass very briefly to this Syriac gospel illuminations that are fantastic, and they date all from already a fairly later time, essentially from the beginning, the first half of the 13th century onwards. So we are already in a phase in which the kingdom of Jerusalem is fallen, and the main bulk of Crusader influence is gone. I mean, as a source, right? So here there are several. The Mongols are arriving, in fact, and therefore there are so many different new changes. Even think about Mamluk power rising in this century, and different changes in military equipment, in military organization in general, right? So the first example is a Syric gospel from northern Syria. By the way, as we were saying in the beginning, here there is actually a few about Syria proper that I found, but there are surrounding areas that are bordering with it, and there is, as we were saying now, there are not essentially great differences in material culture here that we can point out. There are more different styles. So as we were saying, we have this Syriac gospel from northern Syria dated to 1226. It's present at this point at Bishop's Library, Midyat, Turkey. and it displays a very fascinating melange, opological melange. For example, there are helmets with that are typically 12th century European, so kind of an anachronism. Consider that armor was naturally recycled. This is just an illumination, but armor was actually recycled, especially in these areas of frontier, right, where there's not a centralized power that invests, production, weaponry, distribution, in a kind of systematized way. It was normal, right, to have this kind of equipment around. Then there are other, for example, there is a mixture of mail and lamellar armor, right? Even with Byzantine archaisms such as the splinted upper arm defenses and skirt, right? But for the rest, being as armor very similar with contemporary Turco-Iranian armor depicted in other illuminations. Swords can be either straight or single, double-edged. There are imposing axes that appear. Here could be a bit of an Armenian influence as well. And there are simple spears, a mace. There's typical, somewhat the Turco-Mongolian warfare, and even a mysterious trident that, considering the date, which is the moment in which the barely Islamicized Kipchak-Normans formed the backbone of Khwarezmians' marauding army here in the area, used the trident as a tribal emblem. So this might have been, not an actual weapon, but who knows? But being influenced by this steps art. There is another Syric gospel, probably from Harput in eastern Anatolia, dated to mid-13th century. It's preserved at the office of the Metropolitan Bishop of Mardin in Turkey. And in here there is a much greater Byzantine influence. Yeah, we are close to Constantinople in this regard. And there is lamellar armor, right, that reflects a rather strong Turkish rather than Arab influence in the area that had been taken, in fact, from the Byzantines by the Seljuks nearly 200 years before. There is also Armenian influence, definitely. The display of a possible war arm hammer that definitely speaks for an anti-armor weapon. Curved sabers, an axe, spear, small round shields, and even here those damn tridents that pop out knows specifically why. And there's another Syriac gospel, probably from Mosul, here with northern Iraq, dated between 1216 1220. This is preserved at the British Library, manuscript 7170, London. And this source is very important because it's one of the two particularly fine Syriac gospels to survive from the 13th century. The other is preserved in the Vatican Library, Rome, and the weaponry illustrates, let's say, nothing to Byzantine tradition, right? It's really a depiction of contemporary Islamic armament. It's probably very accurate, historically speaking, and swords are straight, slightly tapering or non-tapering. Sometimes they're hung from swords belts rather than baldricks. Spears have very large blades, and in one, perhaps also a bamboo shaft, which may be of specific Iraqi influences from the swamps of the south. And it's, let's say, doesn't have much of a specificity. Helmets are generally conical, though round domed, and also with forward angled forms, right? And they all display what seems to be rigid neck guards that look very much like the 14th century European bassinet, Incidentally, about talking about the Spanish Knights, the other day we were pointing out that this specific feature is present, in fact, in contemporary Spain at this time, and it suggests, in fact, contacts with the Middle East, as we were recalling before. Male is, let's say, in the typical short-sleeved shirt, or maybe also beneath a skirt or kilt, persecuting under the cloth, and it's often worn beneath a sleeveless lamellar cuirass, right? So this is a typical kind of equipment that, various layers of armor, sometimes being worn naturally under some padded armor, and that could be worn also, however, over it, if you were kind of very ultra heavy cavalry, and therefore this is very tough protection. And there are different types, like some lamella could be also of hardened leather, right? Other narrower ones of being of metal, likely. And there is another Syriac gospel, probably from Mosul, northern Iraq, mid-13th century. This is the one from the Vatican Library in Rome, Syrian manuscript 559. In here, the source is even richer than the previous one, and the equipment is largely similar to the one showed in the previous one. There are these extravagantly large blades for the spears. We have curved sabers. This may be a stepped influence. Consider the Mongols at this point having already kind of invested the area. There is some interesting European influence in the helmets. There are the same neck guards that, however, seem to be less flexible than in previous manuscripts. There are semi-rigid aventails or fabric-covered mail, felt, or padding. Mail is shown less often, right? We have even in here a short-sleeved hauberks, and it could be at this point maybe the average length of such armor in the area, and probably considering that there is mail seen on necks and arms, as we've seen, that there could be mail shirt, once again worn under a mail cuirass, right? And the lamellar one, in fact, is seen, however, covering the chest and the abdomen, and just it, right? So not further, parts for I don't know, for the shoulders or something. And there are hints to say that there was an increased Central Asian influence, definitely stemming from the Mongols, right? Or if previously from the Khwarezmian armies. Then we have other sources. There is a Syriac gospel from Mosul, perhaps at least in dated to 1222, showing centurion and crucifixion, that displays a great Byzantine influence, right? There is a short-lived male hauberk with a waist sash. Then instead were rather more common to the fertile crescent. At this point, we have a Nestorian gospel from northern Iraq or western Iran, dated to the 13th century. Here we're getting far from Syria, but depicting the massacre of the innocents. And here it recurs the non-tapering broadsword, right, with having long quillon of very Western form, right? So even here, actually, we were prone to think that Western influences were kind of lost in great part, but they kept arriving, right? It was a contact between these areas and the West still. Then we have an Arabic gospel from Mardin, coming that is of Ilkhanate origin, actually from southeastern Anatolia. This is preserved at the Biblioteca Medica Laurenziana, Eastern manuscript 387, Florence. And this depicts also a flight into Egypt, massacre of the innocents. They're somewhat crudely depicted, and and there is a marked change now. This is dated, as we've seen, to the very end of the 13th century, with swords that are now distinctly curved sabers. So here, the Central Asian influence is spreading, right? And this is obvious given that it's an Ilkhanate manuscript, so they were representing that in typical Mongolian fashion. We also have an interesting carved wooden door detail from an unnamed church from Lebanon, 13th, 14th century. So here we're in the area of the Maronites. This came from private collection. The dating somewhat debatable, as we've seen, but it's very interesting to see the presence of a full male hauberk, right? And possibly some horse archery depicted as well. And because of this reason, especially of the full male hauberk that was spread especially in Western panoply at this point, would make us think of a maybe production happened during Crusader occupation of the Lebanese coast, still in the later 13th century. And yeah, I think we can stop here. Actually, there is plenty of evidence from Syria from other times, but it's not so directly related to Christian sources as the Gospels that we've seen here, and or from directly areas that may be dated still under Christian control. And the general impression we have is naturally an Eastern world without any specific distinction from the prevailing Turkish Persian influence, and with this later injection of Central Asian influences in the later time during Mongol invasion. But we do see evidently also Frankish influence that is to spread even later than the at least to survive at the end of the Crusader states in Outremer proper. And this is important because it's observable also in Cilician Armenia, right, that continued somewhat even after the fall of the Crusader kingdoms to have greater contacts with West, just even as a logistical base for also with trade, etc. That, however, undergoes this further Easternization, let's say, of military equipment. There are fairly heavy, there is fairly heavy armor, as we've seen depicted, which could easily speak for the obvious presence of heavy armor among the Christian, let's say the Syrian Christians, and that, however, are very similar to, type of armor. I mean, they are identical. They should be to type of armor were used by the Byzantines, by the Turks, etc. So that's basically it. I don't want to sound too disappointing, but of course, every time we make videos like this, especially regarding the equipment, we stress the fact that, it's good to have this kind of encyclopedical / wargamistic, approach, saying, the Maronites were equipped like this or that, but actually, or these other troopers were equipped like that. But it's very important to draw these differences, but always considering they're minor compared to the bigger picture, right? For which these armies were largely very, very similar to each other. Right? There wasn't any standardized difference here. That is not very, very far from even being conceptualized, and that it actually doesn't even exist today. If we want to be honest about this, sadly thinking about Syria, that the still area of substantial warfare at this day, therefore in areas that are also difficult sometimes to come to research, to get a better study from locally, hoping that thing will settle down at some point, hopefully, fair way, but that the area is disastered, and I don't think it's going to be that easy. But anyway, this is wholly another topic. So for now, then we will make another video in which we will address a bit, maybe a bit more the organization of all these native Christian troops of the Crusader states, because they really deserve, and they're overlooked, in my opinion. Their presence, their constant presence is undoubtable, right? In this context, it might have been much more important than we think, and surely having a substantial role even in Crusader warfare, as they were basically fighting this, as we've seen, the same way that the Crusader enemies were. So they were a way to level to even the differences and fill the gaps between in this asymmetry. And always bearing in mind that even the same Crusaders could fight, at least in this ways, right? According to the task. But anyhow, for now, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.